The cold Wyoming wind howled across the cemetery, whipping Abigail Foster's black mourning dress around her ankles as she stood motionless before the freshly turned earth. October 1878 had brought more than autumn's chill to the frontier town of Laramie. It had taken her father, her last living relative, and with him, any sense of security she'd ever known. Rain threatened from dark clouds overhead, matching the storm raging inside her. At 22, Abigail was now entirely alone in a world that showed little mercy to solitary women. Her gloved hands clutched a single white rose so tightly the stem bent beneath her fingers. She'd already cried every tear her body could produce over the past 3 days as consumption slowly stole her father's last breaths. "Miss Foster," the deep voice startled her from behind. "The Reverend asked if you'd be needing more time. Storm's coming fast." Abigail didn't turn. She'd barely registered the dozen or so townspeople who'd attended the burial, most out of obligation to her father, the town's former blacksmith. What difference did it make now? They'd all dispersed, leaving her to her grief. "I'm fine here, thank you," she replied, her voice hollow. Footsteps crunched on gravel as someone approached, not retreating as she'd expected, but drawing nearer until a tall figure stood beside her. From the corner of her eye, she saw dusty boots, worn denim, and the edge of a leather vest. "My condolences on your father. Samuel Foster was a good man." This time, Abigail turned. The man beside her stood a head taller, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the darkening sky. She recognized him vaguely: Preston Yates, owner of the Double P Ranch outside town. Her father had often shod horses for his outfit. He held his hat respectfully in his hands, revealing thick chestnut hair that curled slightly at the temples. His face was tanned from long days under the sun, but his eyes, a clear, steady blue, held genuine sympathy. "Thank you, Mr. Yates," she replied formally. "He spoke highly of you." Preston nodded, his gaze moving to the fresh grave. "I respected your father greatly. Not just his smithing, though he was the finest for 100 miles. He was honest to a fault." The first drops of rain began to fall, spattering against the dry ground. "You shouldn't be out here alone, Miss Foster," Preston said, concern evident in his voice. "Not with this weather coming, and not—" he hesitated. "Not with your circumstances." Her circumstances. The polite way of acknowledging what everyone in town already knew: that Samuel Foster had died, leaving nothing but debts and a daughter with no prospects. The smithy had been mortgaged to pay for medicines that failed to save him. By week's end, she'd be homeless as well as orphaned. "I have nowhere else to be at the moment, Mr. Yates," she said with quiet dignity, though her voice trembled slightly. The rain fell harder now, droplets sliding down her face like the tears she could no longer shed. Preston Yates studied her for a long moment before making a decision. He extended his hand, palm up, a simple gesture that somehow contained an offer much larger than itself. "Miss Foster, Abigail, I have a proposition that might sound forward, but it's made with honest intentions. My ranch needs a housekeeper. The position comes with room and board, fair wages, and my word as a gentleman that you'll be treated with respect." His eyes held her steadily. "I'm offering you a home, if you'd consider it." Abigail stared at his outstretched hand, rain now falling in earnest around them. Every instinct for self-preservation warred with her pride. To accept charity seemed unthinkable, yet to refuse out of stubbornness would be foolish when she had nowhere else to turn. "Why would you help me?" she asked, suspicion mingling with desperate hope. "Because your father once helped me when I was new to these parts and nearly lost everything to rustlers. He kept my horses shod on credit until I could pay." Preston's expression remained earnest. "And because no one should stand alone at a time like this." Thunder cracked overhead. Without the protection of trees, they were becoming drenched rapidly. "You don't have to decide this minute," Preston added. "But at least let me take you back to town until this storm passes." Abigail took one last look at her father's grave, now turning muddy under the downpour. She thought of the tiny room above the smithy that would soon belong to someone else, of the possessions she'd already started selling to pay the doctor. What choice did she truly have? She placed her hand in Preston's larger one. "I accept your offer, Mr. Yates, though I insist this be a proper employment, not charity." His hand closed firmly around hers. "Wouldn't have it any other way, Miss Foster." As they hurried toward his wagon, sheltered under his coat held above their heads. Abigail couldn't have known that this desperate decision, made beside her father's grave during a gathering storm, would alter the course of her life forever. Preston Yates helped Abigail into his wagon with careful hands, then climbed up beside her and snapped the reins. The two horses lurched forward, eager to escape the worsening storm. Abigail clutched the wooden seat as they rolled away from the cemetery, each rotation of the wheels taking her further from everything familiar. "We'll stop by your place first so you can gather your belongings," Preston said, raising his voice above the rain drumming on the wagon's canvas cover. "I don't mean to rush you, but that sky looks mighty unfriendly." Abigail nodded, grateful for his practicality. The journey to town took barely 10 minutes, but by the time they pulled up outside the smithy, the streets had turned to mud and rivers of water flowed along the wooden sidewalks. The familiar building, with its attached living quarters, looked forlorn now, the forge cold, the windows dark. "I won't be long," she promised, climbing down with Preston's assistance. Inside, the sparse rooms that had been her home felt colder than she remembered. Abigail moved quickly, gathering her mother's silver-backed hairbrush, a few dresses, undergarments, and the family Bible containing pressed flowers from her mother's garden and the record of births and deaths that now included her father's name. She wrapped her mother's wedding quilt around these treasures, creating a bundle she could manage. A small wooden box caught her eye, her father's keepsakes. She opened it to find his pocket watch, a daguerreotype of her mother, and a letter addressed to her in his uneven handwriting. Throat tight with emotion, she added these to her bundle. When she emerged, Preston was waiting patiently, despite being soaked through. He secured her belongings in the back of the wagon under a tarpaulin. "Is there anywhere else you need to stop?" he asked, helping her up once more. "No," Abigail said softly. "There's nothing else." The road leading out of Laramie quickly became more rugged. The wagon jolted over ruts and stones, forcing Abigail to brace herself against Preston's solid frame more than once. Each time, he steadied her without comment, his attention on navigating the treacherous conditions. "The Double P is about 8 miles east," he explained when they'd left the town behind. "In good weather, it's an easy ride. Today might take us a bit longer." As they traveled, Abigail found herself studying Preston Yates more carefully. She guessed him to be around 30, with lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of squinting into the sun and laugh lines that suggested he wasn't always as serious as he appeared now. His hands on the reins were confident, weathered by work, but not rough. "How large is your ranch, Mr. Yates?" she asked, partly from genuine curiosity and partly to distract herself from thoughts of her father. "Just over 2,000 acres, though only about a quarter is good grazing land. The rest is too rocky or wooded." Pride entered his voice. "Started with just 50 acres and a dream 10 years ago. We run about 500 head of cattle now, mostly Herefords. Me and my 4 ranch hands. Good men. They bunk in the bunkhouse about 100 yards from the main house, where you'll be staying." He glanced at her. "In your own quarters, of course. There's a small bedroom and sitting room off the kitchen that the previous housekeeper used." Abigail nodded, relieved to hear arrangements were proper. "And what happened to the previous housekeeper?" A small smile crossed Preston's face. "Mrs. Abernathy decided at 65 that she'd prefer to live with her daughter's family in Denver. Left us 3 months ago, and between the ranch work and our deplorable cooking, we've been missing her something fierce." They fell into silence as the wagon climbed a steep hill. When they crested it, Preston pulled the horses to a stop despite the rain. "There it is," he said, gesturing ahead. "The Double P." Through the curtain of rain, Abigail could make out a valley nestled between rolling hills. A substantial 2-story house of hewn logs sat in the center, smoke curling from its chimney. Nearby stood a large barn, corrals, and what must be the bunkhouse. Several smaller outbuildings completed the scene. Even in the gloomy weather, it looked solid and welcoming. "It's lovely," she said sincerely. Preston's expression softened. "It's home." They continued down into the valley, the horses picking up their pace as they recognized familiar territory. As they approached the house, Abigail noticed a covered porch wrapping around the front, adorned with several rocking chairs. A large oak tree stood in the yard, and despite the season, she could imagine how pleasant it would be in summer. A young man ran from the barn as they approached, ready to take the horses. "Rough weather for traveling, boss," he called, eyeing Abigail with surprise. "Charlie, this is Miss Foster. She'll be taking over as housekeeper," Preston explained, jumping down to help Abigail descend. "Miss Foster, this is Charlie Wilson, one of my hands." Charlie touched his hat respectfully. "Madam, welcome to the Double P." Abigail managed a small smile, suddenly very aware of her rain-soaked appearance and red-rimmed eyes. "Thank you. Get the wagon under cover and see to the horses, Charlie," Preston instructed, gathering Abigail's bundle. "I'll show Miss Foster to her quarters." The main house was larger than it had appeared from a distance. Preston led her up the porch steps and opened the heavy wooden door, ushering her into a spacious main room dominated by a stone fireplace, where a fire crackled welcomingly. The furnishings were simple but sturdy: a long table with benches for dining, several comfortable-looking chairs, and shelves filled with books that surprised Abigail. "This way," Preston said, leading her through to a large kitchen at the back of the house. A cast-iron stove radiated heat, and copper pots hung from a rack overhead. He opened a door off the kitchen to reveal a small but pleasant bedroom with an adjoining sitting room. "These will be your quarters. There's a separate entrance as well, so you'll have your privacy." The rooms were clean and simply furnished with a narrow bed, dresser, washstand, and in the sitting room, a comfortable chair and small table. "It's very nice," Abigail said, somewhat overwhelmed by how quickly her circumstances had changed. This morning she had stood by her father's grave with no future. Now she stood in a strange house with a roof over her head and employment. Preston set her bundle on the bed. "I'll have Charlie bring in hot water so you can freshen up. There's a trunk of linens in the hall closet. Help yourself to whatever you need." He hesitated. "I know this is all very sudden, Miss Foster. I want you to know there's no obligation for you to stay if you find the arrangement unsuitable, but I hope you'll give it a chance." His directness was oddly comforting. "Thank you, Mr. Yates. I appreciate both the opportunity and your understanding." He nodded. "Once you're settled, come to the main room. We usually have supper around 6, but I imagine the men would be grateful for anything edible whenever you're up to it." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "We've been living on beans and biscuits since Mrs. Abernathy left." After Preston departed, Abigail sank onto the edge of the bed, the events of the day catching up with her. Grief still pressed heavily on her chest, but alongside it now was a flicker of something else: not quite hope, but perhaps its precursor. The opportunity to work, to be useful, to have purpose beyond mere survival. She unwrapped her belongings and placed them carefully around the room, trying to create some sense of familiarity in these strange surroundings. When Charlie arrived with steaming buckets of water, she thanked him and set about washing away the cemetery soil and tears from her face. As she changed into a simple gray dress, one of the few she owned that wasn't for mourning, Abigail caught her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand. Her face was pale, her green eyes shadowed with exhaustion, her auburn hair falling in damp waves to her shoulders. She didn't look like someone beginning a new chapter. She looked like someone barely surviving the previous one. "One day at a time," she whispered to herself, echoing her father's favorite saying. She pinned her hair up neatly, squared her shoulders, and prepared to face whatever challenges this new life might bring. In the kitchen, she found it well-stocked but disorganized. Clearly, the men had been fending for themselves. With practiced efficiency, Abigail set about preparing a simple but hearty meal: a stew with the beef and vegetables she found, cornbread from the supplies in the pantry, and apple pie using preserved fruit. As she worked, the familiar tasks steadied her. She might be in a strange place, but in the kitchen, at least, she knew exactly what to do. When Preston returned to the kitchen, the transformation stopped him in his tracks. Delicious aromas filled the air, the table was set, and Abigail was just removing golden cornbread from the oven. "Miss Foster," he said, genuine appreciation in his voice. "You've worked miracles." Abigail turned, a flush of accomplishment coloring her cheeks despite her grief. "It's nothing special, Mr. Yates. Just simple food. After 3 months of our cooking, this is a feast fit for royalty." He inhaled deeply. "The men will think they've died and gone to heaven." For the first time that day, perhaps the first time in weeks, Abigail felt the ghost of a smile touch her lips. Then perhaps you should call them in for supper. The four ranch hands filed in shortly after, having washed up at the pump outside. They introduced themselves somewhat awkwardly. Besides young Charlie, there was Hank, a weathered man in his 50s with a handlebar mustache, Miguel, whose quiet manner belied his impressive height, and Tom, who couldn't be more than 19, with freckles dotting his sunburned face. Miss Foster has graciously agreed to take over housekeeping duties, Preston explained as they seated themselves at the table. I expect you all to show her the same respect you showed Mrs. Abernathy. Yes, sir, they chorused, eyeing the food with undisguised longing. Dinner conversation was initially stilted, with the men clearly making an effort to mind their manners. But as the meal progressed, they relaxed, discussing the day's work and plans for moving cattle to the lower pastures before winter set in properly. Abigail mostly listened, speaking only when addressed directly. She was aware of Preston watching her occasionally, his expression thoughtful. Miss Foster, he said as the men were finishing second helpings of apple pie. I thought tomorrow I might show you around the ranch, so you can get your bearings. I'd appreciate that, she replied, though I don't want to take you away from your work. The boss does what he wants, Charlie piped up with a grin, then ducked his head when Preston shot him a look. What Charlie means, Preston said, is that one advantage of being the owner is occasional flexibility with my time. Besides, stormy weather like this means most of the herd will stay put in the valleys. Less riding for us. After supper, the men thanked Abigail with almost comical earnestness before heading back to the bunkhouse, leaving her alone with Preston. She began clearing the table, refusing his offer to help. This is my job now, Mr. Yates, she said firmly. I intend to earn my keep. He accepted this with a nod. Then I'll bid you good night, Miss Foster. My room is upstairs if you need anything. He paused at the doorway. I know today has been difficult. I hope you can find some rest. After he left, Abigail completed the washing up, the familiar rhythms of domesticity bringing some comfort. When everything was tidy, she returned to her room, exhaustion settling into her bones. Alone at last, she opened her father's wooden box and withdrew the letter he'd left for her. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal. My dearest Abigail, if you're reading this, I've gone to join your mother. I'm sorry to leave you alone in this world, my girl. You deserve better than what I've been able to provide. Know that I loved you with every breath, from the moment you were placed in my arms. You have your mother's spirit and strength more than enough to forge your own path. I have only one request. Find happiness. Not just contentment or security, but true joy. Your mother and I had too little time together, but even one day of real happiness is worth more than a lifetime of merely existing. Be brave, my Abigail. The world has sharp edges, but it also holds beauty beyond imagining if you have the courage to seek it out. Until we meet again, your loving father. Tears she thought had run dry found their way down Abigail's cheeks once more. She clutched the letter to her chest, missing her father with an ache so profound it felt physical. Outside, the storm continued to rage, rain lashing against the windows of her new home. Find happiness. Her father's final wish seemed impossible in this moment of raw grief. Yet as she lay down on the unfamiliar bed, Abigail felt a tiny seed of determination take root alongside her sorrow. She would honor his request not today or tomorrow, perhaps, but someday. Sleep claimed her eventually, deep and dreamless, as the Double P Ranch sheltered her through her first night as its newest resident. The week that followed Abigail's arrival at the Double P passed in a blur of activity. True to his word, Preston had shown her around the property the morning after her arrival. The barn with its neat stalls, the chicken coop where hens pecked busily, the smokehouse, the vegetable garden now mostly harvested for winter, and the boundaries of what would be considered her domain. The house is yours to manage as you see fit, he'd explained as they walked the property, the air fresh and clean after the previous day's storm. Mrs. Abernathy kept a ledger of household expenses and supplies. I'll advance you funds monthly for whatever you need from town. Abigail had quickly established a routine. She rose before dawn to start the kitchen fire and prepare breakfast for the men, who arrived hungry and appreciative as the sun breached the horizon. The days filled with baking, cleaning, mending, and the 100 small tasks that kept a ranch house functioning. In the evenings, after serving dinner and tidying the kitchen, she retreated to her quarters, often too exhausted to do more than read a few pages from one of Preston's books before sleep claimed her. The physical labor was a blessing. It left little time for dwelling on her grief, though it visited her nonetheless in quiet moments when she turned to tell her father something only to remember he was gone, or when she woke in the night to unfamiliar sounds, feeling his absence like a physical hollow in her chest. On her 8th day at the ranch, Abigail was kneading bread dough when Preston entered the kitchen, removing his hat as he stepped inside. "Miss Foster, I'll be riding into Laramie today for supplies. Is there anything you need?" She wiped flour from her hands. "Actually, yes. I've made a list." She retrieved a carefully written inventory from a drawer. "And I was wondering, that is, if it wouldn't be an imposition." "Yes," Preston prompted when she hesitated. "I'd like to visit my father's grave. I left so suddenly, and her voice caught. Understanding softened Preston's features. "Of course. I'd be happy to take you." Relief washed over her. "Thank you. I won't take long, I promise." "Take as long as you need," he said simply. "We can leave after breakfast if that suits you." 2 hours later, they were on the road to Laramie, this time in better weather. Abigail wore her black mourning dress again, feeling somehow that she'd betrayed her father by setting aside her grief to focus on work. The crisp November air carried the scent of pine from the surrounding forests, and the sky stretched endlessly blue above them. "Your cooking has made quite an impression," Preston remarked as they traveled. "I believe Hank would propose marriage if he weren't afraid you'd laugh him right off the property." The unexpected comment startled a small laugh from Abigail. "Hank must have very low standards if my simple meals impress him so much." "Don't underestimate yourself, Miss Foster. Before you arrived, meals were something to endure rather than enjoy." He glanced at her. "You've brought comfort back to the Double P." She wasn't sure how to respond to such earnest appreciation. "I'm merely doing what you hired me for, Mr. Yates." "Preston," he said, "if we're to share a roof, you might as well use my given name." She considered this. It seemed improper somehow, yet also unnecessarily formal to maintain such distance with someone she saw daily. "Very well, Preston, and you may call me Abigail if you wish." A comfortable silence fell between them as the wagon rolled onward. Occasionally, Preston would point out features of the landscape: a hawk circling overhead, a distant herd of pronghorn antelope, the creek that supplied water to both the town and his land during spring runoff. When they reached Laramie, Preston stopped first at the general store, where Abigail selected the supplies needed for the coming weeks. The shopkeeper, Mr. Holloway, raised his eyebrows slightly at seeing her with Preston but said nothing beyond pleasantries. Their next stop was the cemetery. Preston remained with the wagon, giving Abigail privacy as she made her way to her father's grave. The wooden marker was simple: Samuel Foster, 1830–1878, beloved father. Kneeling beside the now settled earth, Abigail placed the wildflowers she'd gathered along the roadside. "I miss you, Papa," she whispered. "I'm doing my best to be brave, as you asked. I have work and shelter now, at a cattle ranch outside town. The owner, Mr. Yates Preston, he's been very kind." She traced the letters of his name on the marker. "I'm trying to find my way without you. It's harder than I imagined." She remained there, sometimes speaking softly to her father, sometimes silent, allowing the grief she'd been holding at bay to surface. When she finally rose, her knees stiff from the cold ground, she felt both drained and somehow lighter. Preston was waiting patiently, his expression gentle when she returned to the wagon. "Better?" he asked simply. She nodded, grateful he didn't offer platitudes. Their final stop was at the bank, where Preston conducted his business while Abigail waited outside, enjoying the weak November sunshine. She noticed several townspeople watching her curiously, no doubt wondering about her presence with the rancher. As they prepared to leave town, a voice called out, "Well, if it isn't Preston Yates," and with company, no less. A man approached, expensively dressed with a gold watch chain visible across his vest. His smile didn't reach his eyes as he looked Abigail over assessingly. "Thornton," Preston acknowledged coolly. "Good day to you. Won't you introduce me to your lovely companion?" the man pressed, his gaze lingering on Abigail in a way that made her uncomfortable. Preston's jaw tightened. Miss Abigail Foster, this is Jasper Thornton, owner of the Rocking Tea Ranch. Miss Foster is my new housekeeper. Housekeeper, is it? Thornton's tone suggested he believed otherwise. How convenient for you, Yates. Abigail felt heat rise to her cheeks, understanding the implication immediately. Mr. Thornton, she said with all the dignity she could muster, I would appreciate it if you would not make assumptions about my character or my employment. Thornton looked surprised at her direct address, then gave a short laugh. Spirited little thing, aren't you? If you ever find Yates's hospitality lacking, the Rocking Tea could use a woman's touch as well. Preston's hand moved to his gun belt, though he didn't draw. That's enough, Thornton. Apologized to the lady. Tension crackled between the men. Several passers-by slowed, sensing potential conflict. Thornton raised his hands in mock surrender. No offense intended, Miss Foster. I wish you luck in your position. With a mocking tip of his hat, he turned and sauntered away. Preston's expression was thunderous as he helped Abigail into the wagon. I apologize for that encounter. Jasper Thornton fancies himself the most important man in the territory and believes everyone and everything has a price. You don't like him, Abigail observed as they left town behind. No one does, except those on his payroll. Preston's knuckles were white on the reins. He's been trying to buy out smaller ranchers for years. When they refuse to sell, accidents tend to happen: mysterious fires, cattle found dead, water sources suddenly contaminated. That's terrible. Can't the law do anything? Sheriff Blake tries, but Thornton's careful to keep his own hands clean. And he has money for lawyers when accusations do surface. Preston sighed. We've managed to hold our own at the Double P, but it's meant staying vigilant. Abigail considered this new information. Is that why you seemed tense when we first arrived in town? Were you watching for him? Preston glanced at her, surprised by her perception. Partly. Thornton's men are often in town. I didn't want any trouble, especially with you along. The implications of their encounter settled over Abigail. People will talk, won't they? About me staying at your ranch. People always talk, Preston said grimly. But anyone who knows me understands I wouldn't dishonor a woman's reputation. You're my employee, nothing more. Nothing more. The words were exactly what Abigail should want to hear, confirming the propriety of their arrangement. Yet something in his definitive tone left her feeling oddly deflated. They traveled in silence for a while, the rhythm of the horses' hooves filling the space between them. Finally, Preston spoke again, his voice gentler. Don't let Thornton trouble you. His opinion matters less than nothing. Abigail nodded, though her thoughts remained turbulent. Not just because of Thornton's insinuations, but because she realized how little she truly knew about Preston Yates and the world she'd entered. There were currents of conflict and history she was only beginning to perceive. When they reached the Double P, the men were returning from their day's work. Charlie hurried to help with the supplies, while Preston assisted Abigail down from the wagon. Thank you for taking me to town, she said formally, suddenly conscious of the men's curious glances. My pleasure, Abigail, he replied, just loud enough for her to hear. The sound of her name on his lips sent an unexpected warmth through her. That evening, after serving a particularly successful dinner of roast chicken and apple dumplings, Abigail found herself unable to settle. The day's events visiting her father's grave, the encounter with Thornton, the complex undercurrents she was discovering left her restless. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped out onto the back porch. The night was clear and cold, stars scattered like diamond dust across the vast Wyoming sky. The silhouettes of distant mountains were just visible against the slightly lighter horizon. The creak of the door announced she wasn't alone. Preston stepped out, a steaming cup in each hand. Thought you might appreciate some coffee, he said, offering one to her. It helps with the chill. Abigail accepted gratefully, wrapping her fingers around the warmth. It's beautiful out here, she said softly. So different from town. It's why I chose this land, Preston replied, leaning against the porch railing beside her. First time I saw this valley, I knew I'd found home. You weren't born here? He shook his head. Born in Ohio. Came west after the war with nothing but determination and some knowledge of cattle. A smile touched his lips. Worked as a hand on 3 different ranches before I could afford my first 50 acres. You've accomplished a great deal, Abigail observed, sipping her coffee. I've been fortunate. And stubborn. He turned slightly to face her. What about you? Did you always live in Laramie? The question opened a door Abigail usually kept firmly closed. Yet something about the quiet night and Preston's genuine interest made her willing to share. No, we moved there when I was 16. Before that, we lived in Colorado, near Denver. My mother died of fever when I was 14, and Papa couldn't bear to stay in the house they'd shared. She gazed up at the stars. He thought a fresh start would help us both heal. Did it? In some ways. He found purpose in his smithing, and I learned to manage without a mother's guidance. Her voice softened, but I don't think he ever stopped missing her. Even at the end, he called for her sometimes. Preston was quiet for a moment. I lost my parents young in a wagon accident when I was 12. My uncle raised me, but it wasn't the same. The shared understanding of loss created a bridge between them. They stood in companionable silence, finishing their coffee as the night deepened around them. I should let you rest, Preston said eventually. Dawn comes early. Yes, Abigail agreed, though she was reluctant to end this peaceful moment. Thank you for the coffee. And the company. He took her empty cup, his fingers brushing hers briefly. Good night, Abigail. As she prepared for bed that night, Abigail found herself thinking about Preston Yates with new awareness. He was her employer, yet tonight they'd spoken as equals, sharing confidences under the stars. She reminded herself sternly that she was in no position to develop feelings beyond gratitude and respect. Her situation was precarious enough without complicating it with inappropriate attachments. Still, as sleep claimed her, it was the memory of his voice saying her name that followed her into dreams. The weeks leading up to Christmas transformed the Double P Ranch in ways Abigail hadn't anticipated. Snow fell in early December, blanketing the valley in pristine white that sparkled in the winter sunshine. The pace of ranch work slowed somewhat, with the cattle gathered in protected pastures closer to the main buildings and fed supplemental hay to help them through the lean months. Abigail settled more deeply into her role, finding unexpected satisfaction in creating a comfortable home. She discovered Preston had a fondness for apple pie and made it more frequently than strictly necessary. The men's appreciation for her cooking and care was evident in 100 small ways. Hank repaired a loose floorboard in her quarters without being asked. Miguel brought her pine cones and red berries for decorating. Charlie carried in extra firewood to keep her rooms warm, and Tom shyly presented her with a hand-carved wooden spoon he'd made during evening hours. Preston himself maintained a respectful distance, yet Abigail was increasingly aware of his presence. The sound of his boots on the porch when he returned from riding the boundaries, the low rumble of his voice as he discussed ranch matters with the men, the way his eyes sometimes lingered on her when he thought she wasn't looking. 2 weeks before Christmas, he found her in the kitchen, arms deep in flour as she prepared dough for the week's bread. Abigail, he began, then hesitated. I was wondering if you might accompany me to town tomorrow. There's a Christmas social at the church, nothing elaborate, just caroling and refreshments. I thought you might enjoy it. She looked up, surprised by the invitation. A social? You needn't feel obligated, he added quickly. I know you're still in mourning, and if it seems inappropriate, no. Abigail interrupted, making a sudden decision. I'd like to go. Her father's words echoed in her mind. Find happiness. Perhaps it was time to begin trying. Preston's smile transformed his face, creating crinkles at the corners of his eyes. Wonderful. We'll leave after lunch, if that suits. The next afternoon found Abigail wearing her best dress, a deep blue wool that wasn't strictly mourning attire, but felt appropriate for a church gathering. She'd taken extra care with her appearance, pinning her auburn hair in a becoming style and adding a simple brooch that had belonged to her mother. When she emerged from her room, Preston was waiting in the main room, dressed in clean trousers, a pressed shirt, and a dark jacket. He stood as she entered, his expression appreciative. You look lovely, Abigail. She felt a blush warm her cheeks. Thank you. The journey to town passed quickly, filled with comfortable conversation. Preston pointed out a herd of elk in the distance, their breath visible in the cold air as they moved through the snow. Beautiful creatures, Abigail remarked. I've never seen so many at once. They come down from the high country when winter sets in, Preston explained. We leave them be. There's game enough elsewhere when we need meat. When they reached Laramie, the church was already filling with people. Warm light spilled from its windows, and the sounds of conversation and laughter created a welcoming atmosphere. Preston helped Abigail down from the wagon, offering his arm as they walked up the church steps. Inside, evergreen boughs and red ribbons decorated the walls, and candles cast a golden glow over the gathering. Abigail felt a momentary trepidation as several people turned to look at them, but Preston's steady presence beside her gave her confidence. "Preston, good to see you," called Reverend Thomas, approaching with a smile. "And Miss Foster, what a pleasure. I've been hoping to see you again since the funeral. How are you faring?" "Better, Reverend, thank you," Abigail replied. "Mr. Yates has been kind enough to employ me as housekeeper at his ranch. A fortunate arrangement for you both, I'm sure," the Reverend said warmly. "Please, enjoy the refreshments. We'll begin caroling shortly." As they moved through the crowd, Abigail was introduced to numerous townspeople, the doctor and his wife, the schoolteacher, several merchants, and their families. Most were welcoming, though she noticed a few women exchanging whispers behind gloved hands as they observed her with Preston. They were sampling spice cider when a familiar, unwelcome voice spoke behind them. "Miss Foster, what a delightful surprise." Jasper Thornton stood there, immaculately dressed as before, with a beautiful blonde woman on his arm. "May I present my sister, Eleanor Thornton?" "Eleanor, this is Miss Foster, Yates's housekeeper." The pause before housekeeper was subtle but deliberate. Eleanor Thornton's smile didn't reach her eyes as she inclined her head slightly. "How nice," she said coolly. "It's so charitable of you to provide employment to those in unfortunate circumstances, Mr. Yates." Preston's jaw tightened. Miss Foster's skills would be an asset anywhere. "I consider myself fortunate to have secured her services." Thornton's gaze slid between them assessingly. "Indeed. Well, do enjoy the festivities. Come, Eleanor, the Blakes are waiting." As they moved away, Abigail released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "I'm sorry. I seem to attract his unpleasantness." "It's me he's targeting, not you," Preston said quietly. "Thornton and I have history. He uses whatever means he can to provoke me." Before Abigail could inquire further, the Reverend called for everyone's attention. Caroling began, with the schoolteacher leading on the small pump organ. Despite the uncomfortable encounter with the Thorntons, Abigail found herself genuinely enjoying the singing, her clear soprano blending with Preston's surprisingly rich baritone. During Silent Night, she glanced up to find him watching her, his expression so tender it sent a flutter through her chest. She quickly looked away, focusing on the words of the carol, yet the warmth of his gaze lingered. After the music concluded, they mingled further, enjoying refreshments and conversation. Preston was called away briefly by a cattle buyer, leaving Abigail chatting with the doctor's wife, a kindly woman named Margaret. "It's good to see Preston with a smile on his face," Margaret commented, watching him across the room. "That ranch of his has been all work and no joy for too long. He seems very dedicated to it." Abigail replied carefully. Margaret nodded. "Built it from nothing, that one. And held on to it despite Thornton's best efforts to ruin him." She lowered her voice. 3 years ago, Thornton nearly succeeded. Preston's best breeding bull was poisoned, half his hay crop mysteriously burned, and a flash flood damaged his irrigation system, all in the span of 2 months. "How terrible," Abigail said, shocked. "Was Thornton caught?" "Nothing could be proven, of course, but everyone knew." Margaret sipped her cider. "The bank was ready to foreclose when several local ranchers stepped in, contributed hay, lent equipment, even provided a replacement bull. Your father was among those who helped, offering free smithing services when Preston couldn't pay." This new information deepened Abigail's understanding of Preston's earlier comment about her father helping him. It hadn't been a minor kindness, but substantial support during a crisis. "I had no idea," she murmured. "Preston wouldn't speak of it himself. Too proud." Margaret smiled knowingly. "But a woman should understand the man she stopped abruptly. "Forgive me. I shouldn't presume." "There's nothing to presume, Mrs. Blake," Abigail said quickly. "Mr. Yates is my employer, nothing more." The doctor's wife gave her a skeptical look, but merely patted her hand. "Of course, dear." When it came time to depart, Abigail found herself reluctant to leave the warmth and festivity. The social had been her first community event since her father's death, a welcome respite from grief and isolation. Preston sensed her mood as they rode home through the starlit night, a blanket tucked around them against the cold. "You seem to enjoy yourself," he observed, his breath visible in the frosty air. "I did," she admitted. "More than I expected to." "Thank you for inviting me. The pleasure was mine." He glanced at her. "You have a beautiful singing voice. My mother taught me. She loved music." Abigail smiled at the memory. She used to say that singing was praying twice. "A wise woman," Preston said softly. "I wish I could have known her. And your father, beyond our business dealings." The wagon hit a rough patch in the road, jolting Abigail against Preston's side. His arm came around her automatically, steadying her. Neither moved to restore the proper distance once the road smoothed out. "I learned something interesting tonight," Abigail said after a comfortable silence. "About how my father helped you during difficult times." Preston's arm tightened slightly around her. "Margaret Blake has a well-meaning but loose tongue. Why didn't you tell me the full extent of it? That my father was among those who helped save your ranch." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't want you to think I offered you employment out of mere obligation to his memory. It was a factor, yes, but not the only one." His voice dropped lower. "You needed help, Abigail. I was in a position to offer it. The connection to your father simply made me more certain it was the right thing to do." His honesty touched her deeply. "I appreciate that, and I'm glad to know my father made such a difference." They completed the journey in comfortable silence, the stars brilliant overhead and the snow-covered landscape glowing with reflected moonlight. When they reached the ranch, Preston helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you for accompanying me tonight," he said, his face close to hers in the darkness. "It meant a great deal to have you there." For a breathless moment, Abigail thought he might kiss her, and more surprisingly, realized she wanted him to. Instead, he stepped back respectfully, breaking the spell. "Good night, Abigail." "Good night, Preston," she replied, her voice not quite steady. In her room, Abigail sat before her small mirror, unpinning her hair and examining her flushed face. The woman who looked back at her seemed different somehow, less burdened by grief, more alive with possibilities. She was developing feelings for Preston Yates, feelings that went beyond gratitude or friendship. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. He was her employer, her protector in a precarious world. To mistake kindness for something deeper would be foolish at best, potentially disastrous at worst. Yet as she prepared for bed, Abigail couldn't help remembering the warmth in Preston's eyes as they sang together, the protective strength of his arm around her in the wagon, the way his hands had held her waist with such gentle care. For the first time since her father's death, Abigail fell asleep with something like hope warming her heart. Christmas at the Double P exceeded anything Abigail could have imagined. The men brought in a magnificent pine tree from the wooded hills, setting it up in the main room where she decorated it with paper stars, strings of dried berries, and candles in special holders. Preston contributed a box of glass ornaments he'd ordered from back east years earlier, delicate treasures that caught the light and transformed the simple tree into something magical. On Christmas Eve, Abigail prepared a feast roast goose with all the trimmings, mincemeat pies, and a spectacular plum pudding that drew cheers when she carried it in flaming with brandy. The entire household, including all the ranch hands, gathered around the long table that evening, sharing the meal and exchanging modest gifts. To Abigail's surprise, each of the men had something for her. Hank gave her a soft rabbit fur muff he'd trapped and prepared himself. Miguel presented a small wooden box with intricate carvings. Charlie offered a book of poetry he'd purchased in town, and Tom, blushing furiously, handed over a delicate handkerchief he'd asked his sister to embroider. "You've made this place a home again, Miss Foster," Hank said gruffly, speaking for all of them. "Means more than you know." Tears pricked Abigail's eyes as she thanked them. She had prepared gifts as well-knitted scarves in different colors for each man, worked on during quiet evenings by lamplight. When the hands departed to the bunkhouse, carrying plates of leftovers and in high spirits, Abigail and Preston were left alone beside the tree, its candles casting a golden glow through the room. "I have something for you," Preston said, retrieving a small package from beneath the tree. "It isn't much, but I hoped you might like it." Abigail accepted the carefully wrapped gift, her fingers trembling slightly as she undid the ribbon. Inside lay a silver brooch shaped like a delicate rose, small but exquisitely crafted. "Preston," she breathed, lifting it carefully. "It's beautiful. It reminded me of you," he said simply. Strong yet delicate. Her heart swelled with emotion as she pinned it to her dress. "I have something for you as well." She handed him a package containing a knitted scarf like those she'd made for the men, but in a deep blue that matched his eyes, and a leather-bound journal she'd found in town. "For your thoughts and plans," she explained. "I've noticed you making calculations on scraps of paper." Preston ran his fingers over the journal's cover. "This is perfect. Thank you, Abigail." His voice was husky with feeling. They sat together before the fire, the Christmas tree glowing beside them, talking softly of Christmases past and hopes for the year ahead. The comfortable intimacy between them had grown steadily since the church social, neither acknowledging it directly, yet both aware of its presence. "I should confess something," Preston said after a companionable silence. "I haven't celebrated Christmas properly since before the war. It seemed pointless, somehow, without family." "And now?" Abigail asked softly. His eyes met hers, warm in the firelight. "Now it feels like Christmas again." The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken feelings. Preston reached out slowly, taking her hand in his. His thumb traced gentle circles on her palm, sending ripples of awareness through her. "Abigail," he began, his voice deepening. "I know your position here puts you in a difficult situation. I would never want you to feel obligated in any way, but I find myself—" A sudden pounding on the door interrupted him. Preston rose quickly, his expression shifting to concern as he moved to answer it. Hank stood on the porch, his face grim in the lantern light. "Sorry to disturb you, boss, but we've got trouble." Riders spotted along the north boundary. Miguel heard shots. Preston's demeanor changed instantly. "How many?" "3, maybe 4. Miguel thinks they're after the horses in the north corral. Get the men armed. I'll be right there." Preston turned to Abigail as Hank hurried away. "Stay inside, lock the doors. Keep the lamp low." Alarm gripped her. "Preston, what's happening?" "Probably rustlers," he said grimly, strapping on his gun belt. "They see Christmas as an opportunity, thinking we'll be celebrating too hard to notice." "Be careful," Abigail pleaded, fear constricting her throat. He paused, cupping her cheek briefly. "I will. Bolt the door behind me." After he left, Abigail moved through the house, extinguishing most of the lamps and securing the doors as instructed. Through the windows, she could see lanterns moving as the men gathered by the barn. Preston's voice carried faintly, giving directions before the group mounted horses and rode toward the northern property line. The sudden silence left behind was oppressive. Abigail paced anxiously, straining to hear any sound from outside. Had this been what her mother experienced during her father's absences, this helpless waiting, imagining worst possibilities? After what seemed an eternity, the distant crack of gunfire broke the stillness. Abigail's heart leapt to her throat. More shots followed, then silence again. Unable to remain idle, she stoked the fire and put coffee on to brew, knowing the men would need warming when they returned if they returned. The thought that Preston might be injured or worse was unbearable. In the short months since her arrival at the Double P, he had become central to her world in ways she was only beginning to understand. Nearly 2 hours passed before she heard horses approaching. Rushing to the window, Abigail saw the men returning, moving slowly. Relief flooded her until she realized one horse carried 2 riders, Preston supporting what appeared to be an injured Charlie. She flung open the door as they reached the house. "What happened? Is he badly hurt?" "Bullet grazed his shoulder," Preston explained as Hank and Miguel helped Charlie inside. "Nothing life-threatening, but he's lost some blood." They settled the young ranch hand on the sofa, while Abigail hurried to collect bandages and hot water. Charlie's face was pale, but he managed a weak smile. "Merry Christmas, Miss Foster. Sorry about the mess." "Hush now," she scolded gently, helping Preston remove Charlie's coat and shirt to expose the wound. The bullet had indeed only grazed him, leaving a deep furrow across his upper arm that bled freely but hadn't damaged anything vital. As Abigail cleaned and bandaged the wound, Preston explained what had happened. "4 men were trying to drive off the horses from the north corral. We surprised them, but they opened fire. We returned it. His expression hardened. One won't be rustling again. The others fled. You killed a man? Abigail asked, her hands stilling momentarily. He left us no choice, Preston said quietly. He had Charlie in his sights for a second shot. The reality of frontier justice was stark, but Abigail understood its necessity. She finished bandaging Charlie's arm and helped him drink some coffee laced with whiskey for the pain. You'll stay here tonight, she told him firmly. That sofa is comfortable enough, and I want to check the wound regularly. No one argued with her. The other men accepted coffee gratefully before heading back to the bunkhouse, exhausted from the night's events. Preston remained, stoking the fire as Abigail made Charlie comfortable with pillows and blankets. When the young man had drifted into uneasy sleep, Preston drew Abigail into the kitchen, away from where they might disturb him. Are you all right? He asked, searching her face with concern. I'm sorry your Christmas ended this way. I'm just thankful you're all safe, she replied honestly. When I heard the gunshots, she couldn't finish the sentence. Preston took her hands in his. I've been thinking about what I started to say earlier, before we were interrupted. His voice was low, intimate. I know the timing is poor, with your father's passing so recent, but I can't keep pretending my feelings for you are merely those of an employer. Abigail's heart quickened. Preston, let me finish, please, he said gently. I care for you, Abigail. Deeply. More than I thought possible after being alone so long. But I won't press you for any response now. I just wanted you to know. She looked up at him, this man who had offered her shelter when she stood alone at her father's grave, who had given her purpose and gradually rekindled her ability to feel something beyond grief. The realization of her own feelings washed over her with sudden clarity. I care for you too, she whispered. I've tried to deny it, told myself it was inappropriate or merely gratitude, but it's more than that. The expression that bloomed on Preston's face was one of such joy it took her breath away. Slowly, giving her every chance to withdraw, he leaned down and touched his lips to hers in a gentle, questioning kiss. Abigail responded with a tentative sweetness that quickly deepened into something more certain. His arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer as the kiss lengthened, becoming a wordless communication of feelings too new and profound for language. When they finally parted, Preston rested his forehead against hers. This changes things, he murmured. I won't have your reputation compromised. What are you saying? Abigail asked, her hands still resting against his chest, where she could feel the strong beat of his heart. I'm saying that if you'll have me, I'd like to court you properly. And if, in time, you find your feelings match the depth of mine. He took a breath. I would consider myself the most fortunate of men if you would consider becoming my wife. The word wife sent a shock of mingled joy and trepidation through her. It was too soon. She knew her grief still fresh, their relationship just beginning to transform. Yet the possibility shimmered between them like a promise. I would welcome your courtship, she said softly. As for the rest, let us give it time. Preston's smile was understanding. All the time you need. He kissed her once more, briefly but tenderly. Merry Christmas, Abigail. Merry Christmas, Preston. Later, as she checked on Charlie before retiring to her room, Abigail touched her lips, still feeling the imprint of Preston's kiss. Despite the night's violence and disruption, her heart was lighter than it had been since before her father's illness. Find happiness, he had urged in his final letter. Perhaps, against all odds, she had found the beginning of that path on a cattle ranch in the Wyoming wilderness, with a man who looked at her as though she were the most precious thing in his world. Spring came late to Wyoming in 1879, winter reluctantly releasing its grip on the land. By April, however, the snow had retreated to the higher elevations, wildflowers dotted the valley meadows, and the Double P bustled with the activities of the new season. The months since Christmas had transformed Abigail's life in ways both subtle and profound. Preston had courted her with unwavering dedication, respecting her need to complete a proper mourning period for her father while making his intentions clear to everyone at the ranch and in town. Their Sunday rides became a cherished ritual, exploring the ranch's boundaries and picnicking in particularly beautiful spots as the weather improved. Abigail continued her duties as housekeeper, but the nature of her relationship with Preston shifted the dynamics in small ways. The ranch hands treated her with a new deference, somewhere between employee and the future mistress of the Double P. Preston consulted her on decisions about the house and garden, valuing her practical suggestions and keen eye for detail. Most significant were the quiet evenings they spent together after the day's work was done reading aloud to each other from Preston's collection of books, discussing plans for the ranch's future, or simply sitting in companionable silence before the fire, her embroidery in her hands, and a contented expression on his face as he watched her. On a particularly beautiful April morning, Preston found Abigail in the kitchen garden, planting the herbs and vegetables that would supply their table through summer and fall. "You've been busy," he observed, admiring the neat rows she'd already completed. Abigail sat back on her heels, pushing a stray lock of hair from her forehead with the back of her wrist. "I want to get everything in before the spring rains next week. My mother always said plants settled better with rain watering than hand watering." Preston smiled at her earnestness. "I have a proposition for you. The cattle are settled, the men have things well in hand, and it's too fine a day to spend entirely on work. Ride with me. There's something I'd like to show you." Curiosity piqued, Abigail agreed. She'd become a competent rider over the winter months, with Preston's patient teaching. After washing up and changing into her riding skirt, she met him at the stables where he had already saddled her favorite mare, a gentle bay named Poppy. They rode eastward, following a stream that wound through the property. The landscape was vibrant with new-growth cottonwoods leafing out along the watercourse, grass greening on the hillsides, wildflowers creating patches of color amid the verdure. "Where are we going?" Abigail asked as they rode side by side, enjoying the spring sunshine. "A place I haven't shown you yet," Preston replied mysteriously. "It's a bit of a ride, but worth it." After nearly an hour, they crested a gentle hill, and Preston reined in his horse, gesturing for Abigail to look ahead. Below them lay a small, sheltered valley, more lush than the surrounding terrain. A clear stream cut through its center, widening at one point to form a pond where cottonwoods created a natural grove. In the midst of this oasis stood the stone foundation and partial walls of what had once been a cabin. "What is this place?" Abigail asked, enchanted by its beauty. Preston's expression was thoughtful as he gazed over the valley. "When I first bought land here, this was where I planned to build my home. Started the foundation myself, had dreams of raising cattle and a family in this little paradise." His voice held a hint of old pain. "Then the war came. By the time I returned 4 years later, other priorities took precedence, establishing the herd, building the main ranch house where it made more practical sense for operations." He guided his horse down the slope, Abigail following. They dismounted by the abandoned foundation, tethering the horses where they could graze on the lush grass. "It's beautiful," Abigail said sincerely, turning in a slow circle to take in the view. Birds called from the trees, and wildflowers nodded in the gentle breeze. "I've kept the deed to this section separate from the main ranch," Preston explained, watching her reaction carefully. "Never quite gave up the dream, I suppose, though it seemed less and less likely as the years passed." Something in his tone made Abigail look at him more closely. "Why are you showing me this now?" Preston took her hands in his. "Because I want to know if you share the dream, Abigail. Could you imagine a home here?" "Our home." Her heart quickened. Over the winter months, their feelings had deepened into something neither questioned, though they had maintained propriety in their actions. Now, the question hovering between them since Christmas seemed ready for an answer. "Are you asking what I think you're asking, Preston Yates?" she said softly. He smiled, a touch of nervousness showing through his usual confidence. "I am. Rather poorly, it seems." To her surprise, he knelt before her on one knee, still holding her hands. "Abigail Foster, I love you more than I ever thought possible. Would you do me the great honor of becoming my wife?" Joy welled up in her so intensely it brought tears to her eyes. "Yes," she whispered, then more strongly. "Yes, Preston. I would be proud to be your wife." His face transformed with happiness as he rose, gathering her into his arms and kissing her with a passion that left her breathless. When they finally parted, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box. "This was my mother's," he said, opening it to reveal a gold band with a small diamond. "I've carried it with me since my return from the war, waiting for the right woman to wear it." As he slipped it onto her finger, Abigail felt the weight of history and promise it represented. "It's perfect," she said, admiring how it caught the sunlight. They spread a blanket beside the old foundation and shared the lunch Abigail had packed that morning, making plans with the excited energy of new beginnings. "We could rebuild here," Preston suggested, gesturing to the stone foundation. "Expand on what I started. A proper home, with room for a family someday." The thought of children, their children, brought a blush to Abigail's cheeks and a profound warmth to her heart. "I'd like that very much. We could marry in June," he continued, clearly having given this considerable thought. "The ranch will be busy with calving season before then, but by June things settle down, and it would give us time to begin construction here, perhaps have the house ready by fall." Abigail nodded, practical even in her happiness. June would be perfect. Nothing elaborate, just a simple ceremony with the people who matter to us. They lingered in the valley until mid-afternoon, reluctant to leave this place that now held such significance. When they finally mounted their horses for the return journey, Abigail took one last look at the spot that would become their home. "Thank you for bringing me here," she said to Preston as they rode side by side. "For sharing your dream with me." He reached across to clasp her hand briefly. "Our dream now." News of their engagement spread quickly through the ranch and into Laramie. The reaction was largely positive, the ranch hands offering enthusiastic congratulations, Reverend Thomas expressing his delight at performing the ceremony, and most townspeople responding with genuine well wishes. Not everyone was supportive, however. Jasper Thornton made his displeasure known during a chance encounter in town when Abigail was purchasing fabric for her wedding dress. "So the housekeeper becomes the mistress officially," he remarked with calculated nastiness as he blocked her path outside the general store. "Quite the advancement in position, Miss Foster. My compliments on your strategy." Abigail, no longer the vulnerable woman she'd been at her father's graveside, met his gaze steadily. "Mr. Thornton, your opinion of me matters not at all. But I would appreciate it if you would step aside." Thornton's eyes narrowed. "Yates is a fool if he thinks this marriage will secure his position. The double P will be part of the rocking tea before the year is out, bride or no bride." The threat was unmistakable, and despite her brave front, it sent a chill through Abigail. Before she could respond, another voice intervened. "Is there a problem here?" Dr. Blake approached. His normally genial expression hardened into disapproval as he observed Thornton's intimidating stance. "No problem at all, Doctor," Thornton replied smoothly, stepping back. "Just congratulating Miss Foster on her engagement. Good day to you both." With a mocking tip of his hat, he strode away. Dr. Blake watched him go with a frown. "That man grows more unpleasant by the year. Are you all right, Miss Foster?" "Yes, thank you," Abigail assured him, though her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her parcels. "Mr. Thornton seems personally offended by my engagement." "Pay him no mind," the doctor advised, walking with her toward the wagon where Preston was concluding business at the feed store. "He's had designs on the double P for years, one of the few properties that connects his lands that he hasn't managed to acquire." This confirmed what Preston had told her, but hearing it from another source made the threat seem more immediate. He implied there would be trouble. Dr. Blake patted her arm reassuringly. "Thornton is all bluster. Besides, Preston Yates has weathered worse and come through. With you by his side, he'll be stronger than ever." When she related the encounter to Preston on the journey home, his jaw tightened ominously. "I should have been with you. Thornton knows better than to approach me directly. He's not above intimidating a woman alone, though." "I wasn't frightened," Abigail insisted, though it wasn't entirely true. "But Preston, he specifically mentioned our wedding as if he planned something before then." Preston's expression was grim. "We'll be vigilant. I'll speak with the men about increasing patrols, especially at night." He took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "Don't let Thornton taint our happiness, Abigail. That would be giving him exactly what he wants." She nodded, forcing her concerns aside. "You're right. We have too much good ahead to dwell on his threats." The weeks leading up to their June wedding were filled with preparations, both for the ceremony and for their future home. Construction began on the cabin in the hidden valley, with Preston and the ranch hands working on it whenever regular duties allowed. Abigail split her time between her housekeeping responsibilities, sewing her wedding dress, and planning the garden that would surround their new home. Despite their vigilance, trouble came 3 weeks before the wedding. Abigail was awakened in the night by shouts and the acrid smell of smoke. She rushed from her room to find Preston already directing the men as they formed a bucket brigade from the well to the barn, where flames licked hungrily at the roof. Without hesitation, Abigail joined them, filling buckets and passing them along the line. For 2 desperate hours they fought the fire, finally containing it to one section of the barn. By dawn, the danger had passed, leaving behind charred timbers and exhausted defenders. It was set deliberately, Hank reported grimly, showing Preston an oil-soaked rag he'd found. Someone snuck in and started it in the hay storage. Preston's expression was thunderous. "Thornton, we can't prove it was him," Miguel cautioned. "Who else would benefit from crippling us right before summer roundup?" Preston's voice was tight with controlled anger. "Without the barn, we'd have nowhere to store hay for winter. He's trying to force me to sell." Abigail laid a hand on his arm. "What can we do?" Determination replaced anger in Preston's eyes. "We rebuild. Immediately. And we double the night watch. No one rides alone. No one patrols without a rifle." The entire ranch rallied. Neighboring ranchers, hearing of the fire, arrived with lumber and helping hands. Within a week, the damaged section of the barn was rebuilt, stronger than before. Preston rode into Laramie to report the incident to Sheriff Blake, though as expected, there was little the law could do without direct evidence of Thornton's involvement. Through it all, Abigail worked alongside the men, cooking for the volunteers, tending minor injuries, and maintaining the ranch operations while Preston focused on the rebuilding. Her quiet strength and practical nature earned her increasing respect from everyone at the Double P. "You're quite a woman, Abigail Foster," Hank told her one evening as she served coffee to the exhausted workers. "Boss is a lucky man." "I'm the fortunate one," she replied sincerely, "to have found such a home and such good people." As their wedding day approached, the ranch returned to normal operations, though the night patrols continued. The cabin in the valley progressed rapidly, its walls rising, roof beams set in place, and windows installed. It would be ready for them to occupy after a brief wedding trip to Denver that Preston had planned. The night before their wedding, Preston found Abigail on the back porch, gazing at the stars that spangled the June sky. "Having second thoughts?" he asked lightly, though she detected a hint of genuine concern in his voice. Abigail turned to him with a smile. "Not a single one. I was just thinking about my father wishing he could be here tomorrow." Preston wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her head. "I believe he is, in a way, and I think he would approve of the happiness you've found." She leaned back against his solid warmth. "I know he would. He liked you very much." Turning in his embrace, she looked up at the man who would be her husband tomorrow. "I love you, Preston Yates. Whatever challenges come, we'll face them together." His kiss was tender, full of promise. "Together," he agreed. "Always." The wedding day dawned clear and perfect, the Wyoming sky an endless blue vault overhead. The ceremony was held at the Double P, with Reverend Thomas officiating before an assembly of ranch hands, neighbors, and townspeople who had made the journey from Laramie. Abigail wore a gown of ivory silk she'd sewn herself, simple but elegant, with her mother's lace veil and the silver rose brooch Preston had given her at Christmas. As Hank escorted her to where Preston waited beneath an arch twined with wildflowers, she felt a profound sense of rightness, as if every step of her difficult journey had led precisely to this moment. Preston's face as he watched her approach was a study in wonder and devotion. He took her hands in his as Hank placed them together, a symbolic passing of protection and care. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Thomas began, his voice carrying across the ranch yard where chairs had been arranged for the guests. "We are gathered here today to join Preston Yates and Abigail Foster in holy matrimony." The traditional words washed over them as they stood together in the summer sunshine, exchanging vows and rings with voices steady and sure. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Preston's kiss was both tender and possessive, drawing good-natured cheers from the assembled guests. The celebration continued into evening, with tables set up under the trees, lanterns glowing as darkness fell, and music provided by a fiddler from town. Preston and Abigail moved among their guests, accepting congratulations and well wishes from all sides. Mrs. Yates, Preston murmured in her ear as they shared a quiet moment away from the festivities. How does it sound? Abigail smiled up at her husband, happiness radiating from her, like the most beautiful name in the world. Late in the evening, as the celebration began to wind down, Dr. Blake approached them with a concerned expression. I hate to bring troubling news on your wedding day, he said quietly, but you should know Thornton and several of his men were seen riding toward the eastern section of your property about an hour ago. Preston's expression hardened. The cabin. I thought you should be aware, the doctor continued. Sheriff Blake has already ridden out to investigate, but he may not arrive in time. Preston finished grimly. He turned to Abigail, conflict evident in his eyes. I need to go. We need to go, she corrected firmly. It's our home, Preston. He hesitated only briefly before nodding. Round up the men, he instructed Hank, who had overheard the conversation. Quietly, we don't want to alarm the guests. Have the horses saddled and ready in 5 minutes. As the ranch hands slipped away to prepare, Preston led Abigail to their room, where they quickly changed from wedding finery into practical riding clothes. He strapped on his gun belt, his expression grim but determined. Stay close to me, he told her as they hurried to the waiting horses. If there's trouble, there won't be, Abigail said with more confidence than she felt. Not on our wedding day. The ride to the valley seemed interminable, though in reality it took less than an hour. They approached cautiously, without lanterns, guided by the nearly full moon overhead. As they crested the hill overlooking their new home, Preston raised a hand, signaling the men to halt. Below, in the silver moonlight, they could see several horses tethered near the cabin. Figures moved around the structure, and the glint of metal suggested they carried tools or weapons. For men, Miguel whispered, his keen eyes assessing the scene. Thornton's there, the tall one giving orders. Preston's face was set in hard lines. Hank, you and Tom circle around to the west. Miguel, take Charlie and approach from the east. Don't engage unless necessary. I want Thornton caught red-handed by the sheriff if possible. And you? Hank asked. Abigail and I will create a distraction from here. Draw their attention while you get into position. As the men slipped away to follow his instructions, Preston turned to Abigail. Stay behind me, no matter what happens. She nodded, heart pounding but determined to stand with her husband in defending their future. When the men had time to reach their positions, Preston raised his rifle and fired a single shot into the air. The sharp crack echoed across the valley, causing the figures below to freeze momentarily. Thornton, Preston called, his voice carrying in the night air. Step away from my property. There was a moment of confusion below before Thornton's voice responded. Yates? Isn't this your wedding night? Should you be here instead of attending to your bride? My wife and I are exactly where we need to be, Preston replied, emphasizing the word wife with unmistakable pride. The sheriff is on his way. I suggest you and your men depart before he arrives. Laughter drifted up from the valley. Always the optimist, Yates. By the time any law arrives, there won't be much left of your little love nest here. The sound of breaking glass punctuated his words. Preston's jaw tightened. Last warning, Thornton. Leave now. Instead of responding, Thornton gestured to his men, who resumed whatever destructive activity they'd been engaged in. One struck a match, the small flame visible in the darkness. Fire! Abigail gasped, realizing their intention. Preston didn't hesitate. He fired again, this time aiming just above the man with the match. The bullet splintered wood near the man's head, causing him to drop the match in alarm. Next one won't miss, Preston called. Hands where I can see them, all of you. Shouts erupted as Hank, Tom, Miguel, and Charlie emerged from their positions, surrounding Thornton and his men. Caught by surprise and outnumbered, Thornton's hired hands raised their hands reluctantly. Thornton himself, however, drew his pistol. You're trespassing on what will soon be my property, Yates. I've been patient, but my patience has limits. The only trespasser here is you. Came a new voice as Sheriff Blake rode into the clearing, rifle ready. Drop the weapon, Thornton. For a tense moment, it seemed Thornton might ignore the order. Then, with calculated slowness, he lowered his gun. This proves nothing, he said coldly. We were merely inspecting unclaimed property. Unclaimed, the sheriff repeated skeptically. The deed to this land is registered to Preston Yates. Has been for years. He gestured to the tools and oil cans scattered around the cabin. And I suppose those were for a friendly renovation? As the sheriff took control of the situation, disarming Thornton's men and examining the evidence of their intended arson, Preston turned to Abigail. Not exactly how I planned to spend our wedding night, he said ruefully. Despite the tension of the situation, Abigail found herself smiling. It's certainly memorable. Preston's arm tightened around her waist. I'm sorry, Abigail. You deserve better than this. What I deserve is a husband who stands up for what's right and protects what's ours, she replied firmly. And that's exactly what I have. The matter was resolved with surprising swiftness. Thornton and his men were arrested for attempted arson and trespassing, with enough evidence to ensure charges would stick. The cabin itself had suffered only minor damage, some broken windows and splintered door frames that could be easily repaired. Dawn was breaking as they finally returned to the ranch, exhausted but victorious. The wedding guests had long since departed, leaving the place peaceful in the early morning light. We should get some rest, Preston suggested as they unsaddled their horses. Our train to Denver doesn't leave until tomorrow. Abigail nodded, suddenly shy now that they were alone as husband and wife for the first time. Preston sensed her nervousness and took her hand gently. I meant what I said before. This isn't how I planned our first night together. If you'd prefer to wait, Abigail silenced him with a finger to his lips. Preston Yates, I have waited quite long enough to be your wife in every sense of the word. Her voice grew softer, though no less determined. Take me to our room, please. The love that blazed in his eyes at her words warmed her to her core. Without another word, he swept her into his arms and carried her into the house, up the stairs to the master bedroom that would be theirs until their cabin was complete. There, with tenderness and passion, they consummated the vows they had made before God and their community, finding in each other's arms the belonging and completion both had sought for so long. I love you, Mrs. Yates, Preston whispered as they lay together in the soft light of morning, her head pillowed on his chest. And I love you, Mr. Yates, Abigail replied, her heart so full she thought it might burst. Today, tomorrow, and all the days to come. As they drifted to sleep in each other's arms, Abigail's last conscious thought was of how far she had traveled from standing alone at her father's grave to finding love, purpose, and a future brighter than any she could have imagined. The trial of Jasper Thornton became the talk of the territory. His wealth and connections failed to shield him from justice when faced with multiple witnesses and clear evidence of his crimes. The judge, unimpressed by Thornton's attempts to portray himself as a misunderstood businessman, sentenced him to 5 years in the territorial prison, a verdict that sent ripples of satisfaction through the ranching community. For Preston and Abigail, the months following their wedding were filled with hard work and deep contentment. They divided their time between the main ranch house and completing their cabin in the hidden valley, which became their private retreat. By autumn, the cabin was finished, a comfortable 6-room dwelling with a stone fireplace, spacious kitchen, and wide-covered porch where they often sat in the evenings, watching the sunset paint the valley in gold and crimson. Their first Christmas as husband and wife was celebrated with a house full of guests. The ranch hands, neighboring families, and even Dr. Blake and his wife made the journey despite heavy snow. Abigail decorated both homes with evergreen boughs, red ribbons, and candles, creating a festive atmosphere that delighted everyone. You've transformed this place, Preston told her on Christmas Eve as they prepared for bed in their cabin, the main celebration planned for the following day at the ranch house. Not just the buildings, but the spirit of it. Abigail smiled, brushing her hair before the mirror. We've transformed it together. He came to stand behind her, their eyes meeting in the reflection. I have a gift for you. I was going to wait until tomorrow, but... He placed a small package in her hands. Curious, Abigail unwrapped it to find a delicate silver locket. When she opened it, she gasped softly. Inside was a miniature portrait of her father, carefully painted from the photograph she kept in her Bible. Preston, she whispered, tears filling her eyes. How did you? I sent the photograph to an artist in Denver while you were visiting Margaret Blake last month. He fastened the locket around her neck, his fingers gentle against her skin. I thought you might like to keep him close to your heart. Abigail turned and wrapped her arms around him, overcome with emotion. It's perfect. Thank you. He held her close, stroking her hair. You've made me happier than I ever dreamed possible, Abigail. I wanted to do something special. She looked up at him, love shining through her tears. I have something for you too, a gift I wasn't planning to give until tomorrow. Taking a deep breath, she placed his hand on her stomach. We're going to have a baby, Preston. In summer. The wonder that spread across his face was everything she had hoped for. A baby? You're certain? Abigail nodded, joy bubbling up inside her. Dr. Blake confirmed it last week. I've been bursting to tell you, but I wanted to wait for the perfect moment. Preston lifted her in his arms, spinning her around with a whoop of delight before setting her down carefully, suddenly concerned. Should I not have done that? I don't want to, she laughed, cutting off his worry with a kiss. I'm with child, not made of porcelain. Dr. Blake says I'm healthy as can be. They spent that night talking of the future, making plans for the baby's room, choosing names, imagining the family they would build together. Preston's protective instincts, already strong, intensified with the knowledge of Abigail's pregnancy. He insisted on hiring additional help at the ranch so she wouldn't overexert herself, though she protested that pregnancy wasn't an ailment. Winter gave way to spring, and spring to early summer. Abigail's body changed with the seasons, her slender frame softening, her beauty enhanced by the glow of impending motherhood. Preston watched these changes with undisguised adoration, his love for her deepening as she carried their child. On a warm July evening in 1880, after a labor that left Preston pacing anxiously outside their bedroom while Dr. Blake and Margaret attended Abigail, their daughter entered the world with a strong, indignant cry. She has her mother's spirit, Dr. Blake announced with a smile as he finally allowed Preston into the room. And her father's lungs. Abigail lay propped against pillows, tired but radiant, a small bundle cradled in her arms. She looked up as Preston approached, her face illuminated with a joy that took his breath away. Meet your daughter, she said softly, tilting the bundle so he could see the tiny pink face framed by wisps of dark hair. Preston sat carefully on the edge of the bed, reaching out with a tentative finger to touch his daughter's cheek. She's perfect, he whispered, voice thick with emotion. Just like her mother. We'll leave you three alone, Margaret said tactfully, ushering her husband from the room. Call if you need anything. When they were alone, Preston gathered Abigail and the baby carefully into his arms, overwhelmed by love for these two precious beings who had become his world. What shall we name her? Abigail asked, leaning against his strength. Preston studied the tiny face, already showing hints of Abigail's delicate features. What about Sarah? After your mother? Tears of happiness shimmered in Abigail's eyes. Sarah Elizabeth Yates, she decided. Elizabeth was your mother's name, wasn't it? He nodded, too moved to speak for a moment. It's perfect, he managed finally. She's perfect. You're perfect. All of this, he gestured to encompass their home, their life together, is more than I ever dared hope for. As little Sarah yawned and settled more deeply into sleep, Abigail looked up at her husband. Do you remember what you said to me that day at my father's grave? You offered me your hand and a home to share. Preston smiled, remembering. I was terrified you'd refuse. I nearly did, she admitted. Pride is a powerful thing, but something in your eyes. She touched his cheek gently. I saw kindness there. And now I see our future. He turned his face to kiss her palm. A future that gets brighter every day. Later, as twilight gathered and their daughter slept peacefully in the cradle Preston had crafted with his own hands, they stood together on the porch of their cabin, his arm around Abigail's waist as they gazed out over the valley that had become their sanctuary. I used to stand here alone, Preston mused, imagining a family, children playing in that meadow, laughter filling these rooms. But the reality is so much better than anything I could have envisioned. Abigail leaned into his embrace, contentment suffusing her being. My father wrote to me before he died, asking me to find happiness, not just security or contentment, but true joy. She looked up at the man who had transformed her life. I found it, Preston. With you. With our daughter. With the family we're building. His kiss was tender, a reaffirmation of the vows they'd made and the life they were creating together. And this is just the beginning, he promised. As stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky, Abigail thought of how far she had come from that cold October day when she stood alone at her father's grave. The journey had led her through grief to love, from solitude to family, from uncertainty to purpose. Sometimes the end of one path revealed the beginning of another, more beautiful than imagination could conjure. And sometimes a hand offered in kindness could lead to a life filled with joy beyond measure. Epilogue. 5 years later, the Double P Ranch flourished under Preston and Abigail's stewardship. The main house remained the center of operations, but their cabin in the hidden valley was unmistakably home, expanded now to accommodate their growing family. After Sarah came Samuel, named for Abigail's father, a sturdy 3-year-old with Preston's blue eyes and adventurous spirit. And just 6 months ago, twins Rebecca and Rachel had arrived, completing their family with double blessings. Jasper Thornton, released from prison after serving his sentence, had sold his holdings and departed the territory, his power and influence diminished beyond recovery. The ranching community had grown stronger through cooperation, establishing fair practices that benefited everyone rather than privileging the wealthy few. On a golden autumn afternoon, much like the one when Preston had first brought her to the valley, Abigail sat on a quilt spread beneath the cottonwoods, watching Sarah and Samuel chase butterflies while the twins napped beside her. The stream gurgled peacefully, and birds called from the trees overhead. Preston rode into view, returning from checking the northern pastures. He dismounted with the easy grace that still made her heart skip, tethering his horse before joining his family on the quilt. "How are my girls?" he asked, kissing Abigail before bending to place gentle kisses on the twins' foreheads. "Sleeping, finally," Abigail replied with a smile. "They're becoming more like their brother, every day determined to stay awake for fear of missing something exciting." Preston chuckled, watching as Sarah helped Samuel climb onto a fallen log. "They come by it honestly. Their mother never wants to miss anything either." "Speaking of which," Abigail said, "Reverend Thomas sent word that the school board approved my proposal. They'll begin construction on the new schoolhouse next month, and I'll start teaching once it's completed." Preston's face showed the pride he felt in her accomplishment. Over the past year, Abigail had worked tirelessly to establish proper education for the children of outlying ranches who couldn't easily reach the town school. With the support of several neighboring families, she had secured funding and approval for a rural schoolhouse where she would teach 3 days a week. "You'll be wonderful," he said, squeezing her hand. "Those children are fortunate to have you." "Mama, Papa, look," Sarah called, pointing skyward where a red-tailed hawk circled majestically. "I see it, sweetheart," Preston called back. "What a magnificent bird." As their children returned to their explorations, Preston wrapped an arm around Abigail's shoulders. "Happy?" he asked softly. She leaned into him, contentment washing through her. "Beyond words," she replied honestly. The journey that had begun at her father's graveside had led her here to love, to family, to purpose, to home. The path hadn't always been smooth, but every step had been worthwhile. "Beyond words," she repeated, lifting her face for Preston's kiss as their children played in the golden light of a Wyoming afternoon and the future stretched before them, bright with promise.